So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan, Saltwater Junkie here again. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I put together the sumps that I use for my systems. I've been in the saltwater hobby for close to 15 years now. Over that time span, I've put together several different sumps. The smallest one I put together was a 10-gallon under a 36-gallon bow front aquarium. The biggest one that I've ever put together is a 75-gallon sump that I'm using to run my 125-gallon system. So before I actually get to showing you the sump that I'm actually building in this video that's for this multiple systems, all running off one sump filtration, I'm going to be doing an overview of some of the previous sumps that I've built in the past. The reason I'm doing this is I've made mistakes in the past, and I've had some good things that I've transferred into the sump that I'm putting together in this video, and I want you guys to be aware of those things so you don't make the same mistakes that I did previously when building a sump. And then at the end of this video, there will also be a couple icons you can click on if you want to check those out, which include how to drill an aquarium and how I plumb this system in. So one of the scariest things that's ever happened to me with one of my sumps is I was running a external Little Giant return pump underneath this 125-gallon stand. At that time, I was running two 29-gallon aquariums that were connected with hoses. This setup was very similar to what I'm using now in my multi-systems, all running off one sump filtration. And I had to do it for the same reason. I could not put one large sump under that aquarium stand with the way it was built. So by putting the two 29s in, I was able to make a 50-gallon, 60-gallon sump out of that and still be able to get it in and out of the aquarium stand if necessary. That Little Giant pump basically caught on fire. I wasn't at home at the time it did it. I came home, smelled something kind of funny, narrowed it down to under the aquarium stand, and this is what I came home to. So I was very lucky that it didn't do any further damage. The reason I think that pump actually caught on fire is because this aquarium stand is very enclosed. There's not a lot of holes or openings in that aquarium stand for it to breathe, and with those sumps running, creating a lot of turbulence, that turbulence of the water will put moisture into the air, and because there was no place for it to breathe, it would be very humid under that aquarium stand. I believe that moisture in the air is what got into the motor and caused it to short out. So as soon as this happened, I actually decided this just wasn't a good idea. Now I could have changed over to a submersible pump, but I actually had a storage closet on the back side of that aquarium stand, and I got sick of doing all my maintenance under that stand. It was just a pain in the butt. So I replumbed this system and ran the returns and drains through the wall back to that storage closet, and that's where I've got the 75-gallon sump that I put together running that system. Now the only reason I went over that in detail is because that was by far the scariest thing that's ever happened to me while being in this hobby. And it is something to think about. If you notice when you open your aquarium stand and it is really humid, that humidity, moisture don't really mix with electrical and can cause problems. Now during the build in this video, I will go over some other mistakes and helpful tips that I've learned along the way. There's two main reasons that I actually build my own aquarium sumps. The first is obviously the cost. Buying a pre-built sump can be very expensive. I did a quick online search, and even 40 to 50-gallon sumps are well into the $800–900 range. I basically made a 80-gallon sump by using two 40-gallon breeders. On the high side of my guesstimation, I've got no more than $250 in this sump. I'm probably closer to around $200, but I did reuse some plexiglass from a previous project. That's over a $600 savings, and that's money that can be much better spent elsewhere in my opinion, like a better protein skimmer or upgrading to a roller mat filter instead of filter socks, even doing a little bit more livestock once you get your system up and running. The other main reason I build my own sumps is then I can customize them to what I need for the application I'm using it for. And the sump that I'm going to be showing you in this video is a perfect example of that, and we'll be going over more of that as we run through this video. So let's get to it. So I'm going to do a quick overview of how this system is plumbed in so you kind of have an understanding of it. The main 210-gallon tank has a total of 4 drains, 2 main drains, and then 2 overflow drains in case the main drains get clogged for whatever reason. The two 75-gallon aquariums have 1 main drain and 1 overflow each. One of the 75-gallon main drains and one of the main drains off the 210 is going into one of my 2 reef mat 1200 roller mat filters, and then of course the other 75-gallon main drain and the other main drain of the 210 is going into the other one. The overflows are all just going back to some part of the sump wherever they're closest, and I do have those set so they will make noise if they start flowing, so I can hear it, so I know one of my drains is getting clogged. Those reef mat 1200s are both in the first section of my sump, along with my aquarium heaters and a small submersible pump that is feeding my UV sterilizer, which is then plumbed into my manifold that runs my DIY algae scrubber for this system. Then I have 2 drains coming out of that 20-gallon long aquarium. The lower drain returns to that first sump through a filter sock to keep any possible algae that's coming from the scrubber from getting into the main part of the system. And then I do have an emergency overflow on the algae scrubber just in case the main drain gets clogged and it's just going back to the sump. The water then flows to the second part of my sump through 3 bulkhead fittings connected with hoses. The 2 bottom bulkheads are 1.5 inches, and then I have one 1-inch bulkhead with a 1-inch hose on it as an overflow. So when I initially built these sumps, I figured 1.5 inch bulkhead would handle plenty of water volume. However, that 1.5 inch bulkhead was not handling as much water volume as I thought it would, and I had to remove both of these sumps from underneath the aquarium stand and drill another 1.5 inch bulkhead and connect it with 2 hoses to keep up with the water volume that I wanted to flow through this system. This was one of the mistakes that I did make during this build. I figured I was going to drill the first bulkhead at the height I needed for the protein skimmer. However, the protein skimmer height is set by the first wall of the bubble trap, so that wasn't necessary. So the lower you put that bulkhead, transferring that water between the aquariums, as that aquarium fills up, there's going to be more water volume mass, I hope I'm wording this correctly, to help force that water through that bulkhead into the other aquarium. Once doing that, I had no problem with it handling the water volume to the second part of the sump. However, I was getting a slime layer on the first section of my sump because I was not skimming anything off the top layer of water in that first section of the sump. So then what I ended up doing is installing a ball valve on one of the 1.5 inch bulkheads so I could control that flow, raise the water level a little bit in my first section of my sump, and skim off the top layer of water through that top 1-inch bulkhead that I installed, and I haven't had that slime layer developed since I've done that. So my original intent of that top bulkhead was just as an emergency overflow. However, since I ended up having to skim that top layer of water off of the first section of the sump, I obviously have a little bit of a trickle always coming through that bulkhead, and if I notice a lot more than a trickle coming through there, then I know that one of my 2 main drains is starting to get a restriction and needs attention. The first section of the second sump is for my protein skimmer. Then it goes through my triple wall bubble air trap into my return section where I have my 2 Wavemaker return pumps returning that water to the 3 main displays. When cutting the plexiglass for my 3-wall bubble traps, I always make the first wall just a little bit taller than the final wall. That way I make sure I'm always flowing downstream through the sump. Each one of the return pumps is basically a 3-way split to each one of the main displays, and that way if I lose one of the pumps, I still have some circulation going to each one of the main displays to keep that system up and running until I realize that pump has gone bad. And I do have ball valves on every return and the main drains so I control my water flow as needed. Now, I don't have a refugium built into this sump or filtration setup because I go with a DIY waterfall algae scrubber that is about the best nutrient removal that I've found over the 15 years of being in this hobby. One of the problems I've had with my previous sumps is that I get calcium deposits around the black lid of the sump because there is not a positive seal of silicone around that top piece of trim. So what I've done on the past couple of sumps that I've done is just went ahead and added a bead of silicone underneath that black piece of trim, and that has completely eliminated that problem so far. This system's been up and running now for about 6 months, and the outside of my sumps are as clean as the day I put them in, and I have not done any wiping off of those sumps yet. So pretty much all of my sumps, I have bought Aquarium aquariums from Petco when they do their $1 a gallon sale or 50% off sale. So I believe, don't quote me on this, but when I bought these 40-gallon breeders, I think I paid right around 50 bucks a piece for them. And then for the baffles in my sump, I pretty much always used 1/4-inch plexiglass, which is very easy to cut on either a table saw or a miter saw. Now when I first started building these sumps, I used to get the plexiglass and the aquarium sealant from Lowe's or Home Depot. However, for the past couple years, I've been getting these products off of Amazon because of cost and convenience. Another thing to consider is the type of plexiglass that you're going to buy. As far as the color goes, if you're planning on doing any type of a refugium or having any type of a light in your sump for whatever reason, you definitely want to consider getting black plexiglass instead of clear, so you don't start getting algae growth where you don't want it in other parts of your sump. This is a quick clip of the 75-gallon sump that I built, and you'll notice the black walls. The center section was originally going to be for a refugium. However, I ended up making a remote refugium out of a 29-gallon aquarium so I can completely isolate the water going to it and turn it into a quarantine tank if necessary. You'll also notice that above those black walls of the refugium, I've got 2 more pieces of that black plexiglass suspended all the way to the top of the tank. That was just to help prevent algae growth in other parts of the sump by blocking that light from getting there. As far as the silicone goes, I've used several different products. I've always just made sure that they do say they're aquarium safe when I purchase them. When I used to get my materials from Lowe's and Home Depot, they carried the Loctite that said it was safe for aquariums. For the last couple sumps I built when getting my product from Amazon, I went with American Sealant, aquarium sealant. And I have no complaints about this product with the last 3 sumps that I've put together. So right here, I'm cutting the walls for my bubble trap. Now I am doing a 3-wall bubble trap, and the reason I do that is I used to do a 2-wall and use a sponge. I had that sponge get clogged up with debris or whatever, and it would start restricting the bubble trap to the point where it was starving the pump a couple times, and that's why I did not want any sponge material in my bubble trap, so I did go with that 3-wall. After cutting the main walls, I do notch the corners of those walls just a little bit, so I don't disrupt or damage the sealant that is used in the bottom of the aquarium. So before ever putting together one of my sumps, I always try and have the equipment that I plan on using so I can put it in the aquarium to help me figure out where I need to put the walls in my sump. So right here I've got the protein skimmer in place that I'm going to be using, and one of the 2 aquarium pumps that I plan on using in the return section. Now because my protein skimmer is right before the return section in this sump, I did have to make sure that the walls of the bubble trap were the minimum height that was required by the protein skimmer. I usually like to go a little higher than that, once again, in case I update and the new protein skimmer needs a little bit higher level than what the previous one did. However, I did put mine at the minimum because of the amount of take-up volume I needed if I lose power at my house, because of the fact that I'm running 2 75s and a 210, all draining down into the 2 40-gallon sumps. So right here, I'm just double checking with a tape measure where I marked out my walls to make sure I am identical on both sides using a dry erase marker, because the dry erase marker with a little bit of rubbing alcohol will come right off of that glass. If you do go a little deeper than what's necessary for your protein skimmer, you can always make a stand out of plexiglass. If you go too shallow, there's no way to correct that problem. So right here, I'm cutting some 3/8 thick acrylic that I'm using for side plates between my bubble trap, and I'm cutting a taper into it once again to avoid disturbing the silicone that's already in the bottom of the aquarium. Now this thickness of plexiglass can be rather expensive, so I use it sparingly. Right here I'm just using a little bit of sandpaper to roughen up the edges that are going to have the silicone against them to make them so they have a little better gripping force for the silicone. Then I used a little bit of rubbing alcohol on a rag to completely wipe down those pieces and the aquarium on any sides that we're going to be using silicone to create a clean, dry surface for the sealant to adhere to. Now because these pieces are going flat up against the aquarium, I did put a layer of sealant on the bottom and on the complete side of that piece of plexiglass. Once I set it in place, lining it up with the markings that I made in the side of the aquarium with the dry erase marker, I did move it around a little bit, up and down and back and forth, in order to remove all the air bubbles that were trapped between the aquarium and that piece of plexiglass. Now using these extra side plates isn't absolutely necessary, it's just something I like to do. because it helps support the center wall that is basically suspended in the tank. The other thing it helps me do is it makes it so I can butt the two walls that are against the bottom of the aquarium, push up against that, and give me a nice solid edge with some extra strength. So one of the other mistakes that I've made in the past is rushing building these sumps. What I've realized is if I go ahead and put this one in place, let it sit for a couple hours and let it set up, the silicone holds those pieces in place nice and tight. So then when I go to put the next piece in, it's much easier to install. So after letting the silicone in the side plates dry up a little bit and get firm, then I went ahead and put some silicone against the edges of that side plate and set the wall in place up against those side plates. You'll notice I just put a couple more dots of silicone to hold those in place. Then once again, I let it sit for a couple hours until that silicone's set up, which made it way easier to lay that final bead of silicone and spread it out with my finger because it was held tight by those couple dabs of silicone that have dried. This comes in extremely helpful when you're putting in the center wall of your bubble trap because you have very tight tolerances between the other two walls, because trying to lay that final layer of silicone on that center wall when you're restricted by the other walls that are in place can be very difficult to do. Now, because this is a 40-gallon breeder and it is 18 inches wide, my 1/4 inch walls do need an extra gusset in the center to keep those from bowing when the water level is not equalized between the sides. If you're building a sump that's only 12 inches wide, the 1/4 inch plexiglass should hold up without a problem. So right here, you'll notice that gusset, I've got it cut out at the bottom a little bit. That is to make sure that the water level from side to side of that gusset is equalized. I actually put a solid gusset in on my 75-gallon sump I built, and there is a little bit more water flowing on one side of that gusset than the other, just because the floor wasn't quite level where that sump was located. By cutting that groove out in the bottom of the gusset, it equalizes both sides and is not an issue. When laying that final bead of caulking, I recommend doing a light bead. You can always go back and add more, but if you go too much, you're just gonna have that caulking going on either side of your finger, and it's just not gonna have a good final look to it. So now that you've kind of grasped how I put this thing together, during the rest of this build, I am just gonna go over some other situations that I've had happen to me with my sump builds and helpful tips along with mistakes I've made. Now, one thing to keep in mind is not only plan for the equipment that you have now, but try and think about the future and other things you might want to add or go bigger at some point. For example, if you've got a decent sized protein skimmer and you add a lot more livestock to your aquarium and it's not keeping up, you might need to go with a bigger protein skimmer, or you might have bought a return pump you thought would work, but with the extra height of what you're lifting, maybe it's not flowing as much as you thought it would and you end up needing a bigger pump. So as much as possible, what I'm getting at is try and make these sections a little bigger maybe than what you have for the equipment right now in case something like that happens in the future. I also recommend going with as big of a sump as you possibly can fit underneath your aquarium stand or wherever you're planning on putting it, for the same reason as what we just talked about with trying to make the sections a little bigger than what you might need right now. There's really no downside to go with bigger than what you might be thinking of doing if you have room for it. Worst case scenario is you got some extra water volume that's just going to produce a more stable system. Best case scenario, you end up needing that extra room from that bigger sump for additional equipment or bigger equipment than you started with, and it's already there instead of having to tear that sump completely out and start over with another one. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.